Thank you for joining us. I'll introduce myself in just one moment, but first I'd like to make an announcement about this space's accessibility. The community room is T-Coil enabled. If you have T-Coil enabled devices, please feel welcome to switch them on at this time. If you don't have a T-Coil enabled device but would like to use one of our headsets, I've made some available on the table in the back of the room. Tonight's program will be recorded for later distribution by YouTube, so I'll ask for anyone who wishes to speak at any point in the program, please wait to use a microphone before calling out into the room. I'll also request that you silence your cell phones for the duration of the program. My name is Cliff Robinson, and as the Public Humanities Specialist, I lead the library's Public Humanities Initiative, which was made possible in part with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. It is my pleasure this evening to introduce Fara Dabhoiwala, Senior Research Scholar at Princeton University. He is a historian of Britain and the English-speaking world since the Middle Ages, who writes about social, cultural, and intellectual history from the Middle Ages to the present. He previously taught at Oxford, where he is now a Life Fellow of All Souls College and of Exeter College. Previous publications include his book, The Origins of Sex, A History of the First Sexual Revolution. Translated into 7 languages and widely reviewed, this book tells the story of the Enlightenment origins of modern Western attitudes to sex. It drew on pictorial, fictional, judicial, philosophical, and other kinds of evidence connecting together social, intellectual, literary, legal, political, and other kinds of history. He is also writing the first ever biography of the 18th century Black Jamaican polymath Francis Williams, based on newly discovered sources. Committed to public engagement and the communication of historical scholarship to as wide an audience as possible, he has made radio and TV for the BBC and other channels, and his writing appears in the New York Review of Books, The Guardian, the London Review of Books, and the Shanghai Review of Books, among other places. Fara joins us this evening to present his new book, What is Free Speech? The History of a Dangerous Idea, published in August of this year by Harvard University Press in North America and by Penguin Random House in the rest of the world. He is writing, he is also, repeated something here. I'm confusing myself. So the publisher describes the book as follows. Fara Dabhoiwala explores the surprising paths free speech has taken across the globe since its invention 300 years ago. Though free speech has become a central democratic principle, its origins and evolution have less to do with the high-minded pursuit of liberty and truth than with the self-interest of the wealthy, the greedy, and the powerful. Free speech, as we know it, is a product of the pursuit of profit, of technological disruption, of racial and imperial hypocrisy, and of the contradictions involved in maintaining openness while suppressing falsehood. For centuries, its shape has everywhere been influenced by international, not just national events. Nowhere has it ever been equally available to women, the colonized, or those stigmatized as racially inferior. Rejecting platitudes about the First Amendment and its international equivalents, and leaving no ideological position undisturbed, What is Free Speech is the unsettling history of an ideal as cherished as it is misunderstood. Reviews and interviews for What is Free Speech demonstrate how much attention the book is already receiving. They have already appeared in numerous venues, including the Times Literary Supplement, The Guardian, the New York Review of Books, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and elsewhere. So I understand that Fara will do a signing after the event tonight, so our friends from Labyrinth are here to support. So feel free to purchase a copy this evening if you would like to, and you can have it personalized. Fara is joined in conversation tonight by Jane Manners, who is an associate professor at Fordham Law and a legal historian who teaches tort legislation and regulation and American legal history. Her scholarship centers on 19th century constitutional history, specifically focusing on congressional and presidential powers. She has written on the development of congressional petitioning, early American understandings of the president's war powers, and the evolution of laws governing officer removal. Her scholarship has appeared in both the Fordham Law Review and the Columbia Law Review, among other places. Prior to joining Fordham, she was an assistant professor at Temple University, and she served as a fellow at New York University School of Law, Columbia Law School, and the New York Historical. Let's thank our guests again for being here with us, and we'll head right into the program.
Thank you so much, Cliff. Am I on? Yes, I am on. Yes, good. Okay.
Now I'm on. Okay. Thank you all for being here. Fara, thank you for being here. I think the first question that I would like you to answer is to tell us a little bit more about what inspired you to write this book.
Sure. Can I just say, I'm so pumped to be at the Princeton Public Library. It's one of my favorite places in the world, and I'm very honored by the invitation. Thank you all for coming out. So how I came to write this book is related to my previous book, which Cliff kindly mentioned, which is still available in all good bookshops, The Origins of Sex. And when I published that book and went around talking about it, almost immediately I was censored in various minor and major ways, and I was deplatformed in my hometown of Oxford. And all sorts of things happened because, as you can imagine, talking about sex is something that people often love to police, publicly talking about it. And I went around the world, and it opened my eyes to how different norms are about this subject everywhere. But so I was sensitized to that fact about, freedom of speech on this subject being different everywhere, and being policed and censored myself was a uncanny experience. No one likes to be told to shut up. And then I went to China because the book was published in Chinese, and that really blew my mind because, first of all, I was censored, that's by the by, but the whole apparatus of censorship that the Chinese Communist Party, and this is 10 years ago, this is in 2015, was already then putting in place to police the minds as well as the utterances of the population of China was insane. And I was really perturbed by that. I spoke to intellectuals locally about what it was like to live in this society. And I came back really horrified and thinking, well, I believe in free speech. Why do they behave like that? Why do we all believe in free speech? And then if we all believe in free speech, why can we never agree on it? And I was at that time living in England. Everyone in England loves free speech. No one can agree exactly on what it means. There are endless fights about it. And the same is true across Europe. And then shortly after that, I moved to this country. And I realized it also is an issue in this country. And I thought at the time, 2015, it's peak free speech craziness now. It's such a mess. This moment will pass, but I should hurry up and write a book about it and figure out where this comes from. Happily and unhappily, the moment has not passed. It's even more of a crazy mess now. But I wanted to figure out where these ideals came from and how we've ended up where we are in the way that we all believe in free speech, but none of us can agree on it. And now it's a transnational problem as well. As you may know, Europeans are trying to regulate American social media companies. That's led to huge transatlantic cries of censorship by the American government and by those companies themselves. And so the problems are no longer just national, but international. So I'm trying to set some light on that.
Right. And as we'll get to, in its correct international framing, as opposed to the kind of national framing that I, as someone who teaches American legal history in a law school, am very used to.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to read out some things that I've written down, the kind of the supposed truths of absolutist free speech that Fara sets out to kind of knock down or contextualize. One is that speech is not as dangerous as action. Another is that truth does not always win out. Another idea that Fara explodes is that free speech is kind of egalitarian, that everyone has the right equally to speak freely. And I think the way Fara conveys the kind of, or tears apart these kind of ideas of that kind of prop up the importance of a kind of absolute version of free speech is to tell us the story of where these ideas came from, where free speech comes from. And I'm going to ask Fara to tell you a few of those kind of really revealing historical episodes. And the first that I'm hoping Fara can tell us about is the context in which Cato's letters emerged. So I am not a First Amendment scholar, but I am a legal historian, and I do know that Cato's letters is understood to be the kind of first articulation of free speech as an individual political right, that it serves a political purpose and that we possess a right to criticize our rulers. So this is where Cato's letters is this early 18th century series of publications in a London newspaper that then gets seized upon by the American colonists and revolutionaries who kind of adopt the absolutist framing of free speech rights and put it in first in kind of in kind of revolutionary writing, and then in the United States Constitution and various state constitutions. But as I now know from Fara, the history is so much more complicated than that. So I was hoping...
Interesting. Not complicated is a bad word to
Okay,
use.
fine. Yeah, no,
it's
you're
a
right.
page-turning, riveting, interesting story.
Someone asks a historian a question, they say, "Oh, the truth is
Yeah,
complicated."
no, that's the
Everyone's
real.
like,
They are. So boring.
Yeah,
So
interesting.
who here has ever heard of Cater's letters? Yeah. Okay, a few people. So let me also say. So when I started out on this project, I knew, because I'm a historian of the 18th century, I knew that actually modern free speech emerges in the 18th century. Before that, people think very differently about speech, and I can explain that in a minute. But I also thought, there's no way I'm going to make any contribution to the history of the United States, because that's the only country in the world where people have obsessively celebrated and thought about the history of free speech for centuries. And there's a mountain of scholarship on the history of the First Amendment and its evolution up to the present. And I just was going to read my way into that and then do some real research on other places and then combine the two. But to my great surprise, almost immediately that I started reading into the American material, I did make some amazing discoveries. So let's back up a little bit. Free speech is an ideal that's taken many forms across the centuries. There are classical ways of thinking about it, right back to the Greeks and the Romans. But our modern concept of it emerges around 1700. And our modern concept of it is basically the idea that everyone as a citizen has a right to speak out on matters of public concern. I call it political free speech. That basic idea doesn't exist before the early 18th century. And one reason it doesn't exist is that before the 18th century, across the globe, every culture takes a very different view of speech and utterance, speech and writing, later printing. And that is that they mainly wish to control it. Freedom of expression is an exceptional mode. It's often seen as something dangerous. And the reason that they put a huge amount of effort into controlling it, and this is where censorship of print comes in to it as well, which is universal before the 18th century, is for a number of reasons that we don't agree with anymore, but also some reasons that are still relevant. And the reasons that are still relevant are, first of all, everyone knows that speech is an action in the world. People say things and write things and print things and publish them to make a difference, to persuade other people of things, to communicate their ideas to other people. It's an action. It's mainly a fleeting, kind of trivial action, but also the second thing that they know is that sometimes it can be a potent and even a harmful action. And the thing that all those cultures of the past focus on is the danger especially of untruth, the danger of lies, of misinformation, of false news. The earliest English law against false news dates from the 13th century. It's a very old problem. And they focus on this because, A, everyone can see that individuals, if they're lied about and their reputation is trashed, that's harmful to an individual, especially in these face-to-face societies where your reputation is really very crucial in your day-to-day life. And secondly, they see that this is dangerous to the public because, and again, this is a historical fact, misinformation, lies, untruth about all sorts of things leads to riots, pogroms, bloodshed, murder, violence, political unrest, upheaval. It does so all the time. Lies spread very quickly. Rumors and misinformation are very hard to control. So that is why they put a huge amount of effort into controlling these things. That all changes in the early 18th century, around 1700, and it changes first in England for two reasons. First is there's a new kind of politics that develops there, the politics of popularity, where the first time that you have two political parties, the Whigs and the Tories, who are appealing to the people and constantly battling for elections and claiming to stand for and embody the voice of the people. And this is a hyper-partisan atmosphere. And the second thing that happens at the same time is the breakdown of pre-publication licensing, as they call it at the time, pre-publication censorship of controversial print in England. I won't go into the weeds about why that happens. It's basically an accident. But out of that explodes a new world of mass media, of print, of new kinds, new forms, very fast-paced, the first age of newspapers, basically, and political print of various kinds. And so in the early 18th century, in London especially, people start to get addicted to this new world of mass, fast-paced news. They like having newspapers. They enjoy the partisan polemic that they're now able to indulge in. And they celebrate what they call the liberty of the press. The press is now free to publish what it likes. You can still be prosecuted if you do something objectionable or libelous, but they call that freedom of the press. But no one can theorize this very clearly. They just have it as a slogan. And the reason that they can't theorize it in any kind of cogent way is that everyone can see that the liberty of the press has also made worse all the age-old problems of lies and misinformation and slander and untruth, especially in a partisan atmosphere. So that's one problem. And the second problem, which everyone at the time immediately sees as well, is this new world of mass media, newsprint, is incredibly corrupt. It's mercenary. Newspapers exist to make money. They're always trying, there are all these startups trying to make money out of this new mass media world. Most of them go down, some of them are successful, then they're hugely successful. They exist to make money, to sell advertising, to get people to pay for their product. And journalists are constantly writing for money, and publishers are constantly switching sides for money because one political party will pay them better than the other, etc. Okay. So out of this, all that people come up with is a very crude sense that liberty of the press is good. You know, it's good to have more news and to allow people to debate, but when it goes too far, if it's abusive or slanderous or spreading misinformation, that's not liberty, that's license or licentiousness. That's the 18th century word for excessive freedom or abuse of freedom. So there's this balancing model between liberty of the press, good, licentiousness, bad. The final reason they can't theorize this is that everyone can see this is an incredibly subjective thing to determine, ultimately. Where the line lies between liberty and license is essentially in the eye of the beholder. It's very subjective. Everyone can see that politicians, when they're in opposition, are always banging on about how they stand for liberty of the press. The moment they have power, they're all about curbing licentiousness. Anyway, so that's the model. That's the balancing model. That is the first way of thinking about free speech. And it remains the main, basically the main way of thinking about free speech, as we can talk about later, from then until now in most countries. But into that moment, in 1721, two people invent an alternative way, an alternative theory of free speech. And they do so, these guys are called, they're completely obscure London journalists called Thomas Gordon and John Trenchard. And they're writing this column called Cato's Letters. Every week they write a column. It becomes hugely successful because it's essentially a very partisan attack on the government of the day for its mismanagement of the economy, for doing everything wrong. And in the course of that, they're basically giving their readers easy to digest summaries of all the great Republican thinkers, political theorists of the past, Machiavelli, Locke, Harrington, etc. This is what they say about, the economy. This is what they say about religious freedom, etc., etc. But as part of that, they also have this extraordinary new argument, which is the only original bit of their column, but it becomes tremendously successful, which is about freedom of the press and freedom of speech. And their argument about freedom of speech is not about balancing rights and harms and so on. It's completely different. They say, one, liberty of the press is the most important freedom of all. It's the bulwark of liberty, that's their phrase. All other freedoms depend on the freedom of expression. That's one. Two, if you allow the people complete freedom of expression, the people will always see the truth and agree on that truth, and then you will arrive at the truth. 2. 3, the people's governors, the government, anyone in power is always out to amass more power and indeed to end up tyrannizing over the people. You can't trust governors ever. And the moment that you see any attempt to infringe on freedom of speech, you know you're on a slippery slope to tyranny. That's it. That's their theory of speech. Becomes immensely popular. This text, Katie's Letters, is endlessly republished. And especially in North America, it becomes the most important text of political theory through the 18th century. The revolutionaries' main source of ideas about everything, but also about press and print, is Katie's Letters. And so in 1776, when they're engaged in a revolution against tyranny, they understandably draw from this text when they're drawing up the declarations of rights, which say things like freedom of press should be inviolable. It's basically this absolutist rhetoric that they take from Katie's Letters. And then in 1789, the same thing happens. James Madison and his friends basically are channeling those same declarations of rights and putting them into the Bill of Rights. That's how you end up with the First Amendment, having this strange, completely globally unique absolutist formulation. Congress shall make no law, that's it. Now, this is a well-known story, as Jane was alluding to. Everyone knows that the First Amendment basically goes back to Katie's Letters. Everyone celebrates this. But when I started investigating it, I made 2 extraordinary discoveries. And I'll say it very quickly, because I realize I'm giving a very long answer to your one question. But it's kind of cool, and I would like people to know. So the first thing I discovered is this text makes no sense at all, given the context that I just sketched for you, where everyone else knows that the world of media is hugely corrupt, that the real problems of misinformation and untruth and slander are just amplified by this new technology, that the people don't agree on everything. If you let them just, it's a hyper-partisan world in which people absolutely don't agree. None of this makes any appearance in their text. It's all completely ignored. I thought, this is really strange. Why is that? Why are they doing this? And the second thing I discovered is, first of all, they're doing this because they're defending their own actions as hyper-partisan, polemical journalists attacking the government. They want to say, you can never libel anyone, attacks on the governors are always permitted, the truth will always out. So that's the reason they're doing it. But the even deeper reason, which really is fascinating, is they are writing, like every other journalist at the time, for money. And they are writing in particular to get noticed by the government, who are much richer than anyone else, to get noticed by them. And soon enough, Thomas Gordon is noticed by the government ministers, and they take him out to dinner secretly, and they say, Tom, you're such a good writer. Why are you wasting your time rabble-rousing like this? Come and work for us. We can pay much better. It's a much securer life. We'll make you. And now you're just, hacking away. Who knows where that will end? And he does. It's completely secret. It's completely behind the scenes. All these things are anonymous. It's not visible to their readers. But as he's writing Katie's Letters, the people are always right, the governors are always bad. He starts writing simultaneously anonymous columns for government propaganda, saying things like, misinformation is everywhere. You can't believe everything you read in the papers. Governors are trying their best. And then they do a deal. They shut down Katie's Letters. They stop publishing them. And Thomas Gordon switches sides and becomes the Prime Minister Robert Walpole's chief propagandist. He becomes then the master, the puppeteer of a whole stable of hack writers who are churning out propaganda for the other side. So it's a really, really problematic, mendacious text, corrupt text, and yet it's the origin of our great First Amendment. So it's a way into I think exploding the idea that this is a simple problem and this is a simple history. Free speech is not a simple problem, and its history is fascinating. I'm sorry, I'll be very short in the next answer, Jim.
No, that was terrific. I mean, one of the tendrils of that story is that their publisher, Elisha Dupre, ends up coming to the United States and making his living basically as a scrivener for powerful slaveholders, among others, which kind of encapsulates one of your other themes, which is that the history of free speech has always been in some ways a history of weaponization, right? Recently, Justice Kagan talked about the weaponization of the First Amendment. But the history of this...
It's always been a weaponized slogan.
It's always been weaponized, and it's always been tied to kind of very extreme differentials in power.
Yeah. I mean, free speech is in the present as in, it's never been just about the words that you say. It's always about, and this is a truth more generally about communication. It's never just about the words. It's always about who is speaking, what is the audience, what is the intention of the speech, how much is it amplified, what is the context. The ultimate meaning of any utterance depends on those things. And the same is true of not just the practice, but also the theory of free speech. It's one of the themes of the book, that if you look closely, you see, for example, that Cato's Letters as a text is very heavily invested in pretending that speech is something that men do. It's not something, or free speech, something that men do, because free speech is about political speech, and that is something that only men do. And women are just, off gossiping and having little chit-chats and stuff like that. They don't speak in the public sphere. And that's actually not true. If you look at early 18th century London, women are very powerfully present as journalists, as publishers, as philosophers, and so on. So they're pushing back against that. It's a kind of attempt to create a mythical, very gendered world in which freedom of speech is a male thing. Anyway, and there are endless examples through the book and through history of how not just people have tried to use that kind of argument to silence women, but also that once the idea is out there that freedom of speech is a good thing and that the slogan that you could weaponize yourself, women too adopt and talk about free speech to pursue their own political ambitions. So that from the 18th century onwards, we find poets and female writers talking very eloquently about freedom of speech. For them, it's mainly about not being silenced by their husbands and not being told to shut up and not being mansplained all the time. Anyway, and equally, it's there at the origin point of the early feminist movement in this country, which comes about, as some of you may know, because abolitionist women are told they can't contribute to the cause of abolition and they should shut up and not take part in public debates on that subject. And so they go away and realize that actually the main thing they want is to be able to speak out publicly as women. Okay, so that's an important theme. And the other aspect of that I just very quickly highlight is that free speech is also an idea that is basically invented by white European propertied men in the 18th century, the same kind of people who then go around the world telling other people to shut up. So not just women should shut up, but brown people should shut up, natives should shut up, black people should shut up, slaves should absolutely never say anything. And so I became very interested early on in how this played out across the globe in places where people are being colonized and doing the colonizing, shouting very loudly about liberty and really believing in liberty, and at the same time denying that liberty to others. And that's a fascinating story, again, of how not just the practice of freedom of expression, but also its theories have always been problematically entangled in relations of power.
Yeah. I am not going to ask you to talk to us about India and John Stuart Mill, although that is a completely fascinating section of your book. And when you all buy it, you should read that part. But in the interest of time, I want to move us.
Yes. I'll be very brief.
No. So the story that I teach, reading my esteemed colleagues in legal history when I teach legal history, is that you essentially had a kind of benighted view of speech in which you allowed the government to regulate in various pernicious ways, or ways that were often pernicious. This is a kind of 20th century story, but it reaches back into the late 19th century. And then eventually, there's always the vignette of Justice Holmes in the summer of 1919, talking to Zechariah Chafee, a Harvard Law School professor, and seeing the light that really the First Amendment has to be interpreted in an absolutist way. And Justice Holmes captures this idea in what is initially a dissent, but then later on becomes the kind of standard of First Amendment jurisprudence, which is the absolutist interpretation of the First Amendment. What I did not know when I taught that story is that there is an equally, more robust history of what Fara would call the balancing approach to speech over the course of, since the founding, straight up through this Holmesian moment in 1919, and then extending beyond it, right up until the 60s, essentially, where the United States was kind of in step with the rest of the world in seeing that speech was a powerful weapon as well as important to protect, and that you had to kind of strike a balance. And so the Constitution, as interpreted by the court, really allowed legislatures within some bounds to strike that balance until this kind of new absolutist approach takes over. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about
A little bit, yes.
Just a little bit more about that.
Let me just say, one of the arguments of the book is that there are basically only two ways of thinking about free speech in a very kind of basic way. One is this approach that foregrounds that it's a matter of rights, but also responsibilities, freedoms and harms, and the other is to start with the idea that it's an absolute right and then figure out the consequences further down the line. And I try to show in the book that actually the whole world took for granted that this was a matter of balance until the 1960s. That's the moment, that's only then that American attitudes really swerve off in a much more libertarian direction, and that's the origin of all the American platitudes that people in this country now take for granted, like, speech is separate from action, that speech cannot really cause harm. Even if it does cause harm, the only possible remedy is more speech, counter speech. And that ultimately underlying all those platitudes and presumptions is the notion that the truth will ultimately win out. I think those are all very problematic and simplistic presumptions, but I also try to show that until the 1960s, Americans thought rather differently about it, and what I call the libertarian swerve is quite late. So that also goes right back to, let me say one more thing, actually. So the balancing approach and the absolutist approach, neither of them is superior. Both of them lead to serious problems. The balancing approach leads to serious problems because if you're really going to do seriously, if you're really seriously going to attend to the fact that speech is incredibly nuanced and contextual, you'll end up making all sorts of apparently inconsistent judgments about the same words uttered by different people. That's a mess. It creates all sorts of problems. It's going to create free speech martyrs who say, why can't I say that? She can say that. It's also always subjective. Any laws that you make can be weaponized. It creates serious problems. All I'm trying to show in the book is that the absolutist approach also causes serious problems, and we should be aware of those. They're different problems, but they're equally serious. Okay. One thing I realized that I talk about in the book, and I won't be able to go into the detail of it, is that in 1789, even before the First Amendment had been ratified, Americans looked at that text and looked at an alternative text which took a balancing approach and said, hey, that balancing approach is much superior. And that text was agreed just a few months after the First Amendment, and it's a declaration of the rights of man that people at the time drew up in Paris in the French Revolution. French revolutionaries are intensely in touch with the Americans. They're writing back and forth all the time about the Declaration of Rights. They're doing this at the same moment. The Americans finished just a little bit earlier. But if the post had not taken 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic in those days, the whole course of free speech history might well have been different. And this is proved to me by the fact that in 1789, immediately, also in 1789, a third thing is happening. In Philadelphia, they are redoing the Pennsylvania state constitution, and they're redoing the Declaration of Rights. And no one has ever noticed this, but what they do basically is take the French text and incorporate it straight in to their Declaration of Rights. And then after that, every single other state and every new state, until Alaska, all of the states use that balancing formulation because it's clearly superior. And at one point in 1789 in Pennsylvania, someone says, well, we've got this new thing that's just come down from New York. Shouldn't we just use that formulation for our Declaration of Rights? Congress shall make no law. We'll just say the state shall. And everyone says, no, that's visibly inferior. And they have a big vote, and they decide to go with the French formulation. So anyway, that's one example of how the balancing attitude to Americans early on seems like just a cleverer way of acknowledging the real difficulties of free speech. And then...
And just to give an example of what the balancing approach is, it's something like...
The French Declaration says everyone should have the right to freedom of speech and writing in the press. It's one of the most valuable, precious rights of all, but they should also be held responsible for the abuse of that right as determined by law. It's clearly, it's a great thing. If you abuse it, and there's a law about that, you can be punished. It's not that complicated. Another kind of example of, and there are many examples of how Americans thought about this differently, but the one I really want to focus on quickly is the mass media. Ever since the early 19th century, people had started to see across the globe that the mass media, print in those days, was immensely powerful shaper of public opinion. But also that the incentives of the mass media, the purpose of the mass media is not to spread truth and enlighten the people, it's to make money, it's to sell advertising, it's to enrich its owners and to advance their political aims. And out of that insight comes a hugely sophisticated critique of the mass media and a rethinking of what free speech should really mean across the political spectrum. Socialists and communists do this, but so do many conservative thinkers. And by the 1930s and 40s, that is the main theme in American First Amendment scholarship, that it's too simplistic to think just in terms of the individual on the one hand and the power of the state on the other hand. You really need to look at the power and the importance of the mass media in amplifying certain voices, silencing other things, shaping public opinion. And so the Supreme Court is persuaded by this in various ways. And this feeds into things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that Eleanor Roosevelt chairs in 1948, which defines freedom of speech as both a right and a responsibility, and also talks about the freedom of information. This is how people conceived of the idea that the mass media should be held to also somehow benefit the public good. So instead of just the individual and the government, you also need to think about the public and its rights, and think about free speech as a collective matter of collective right. The First Amendment as envisaging some thing to do with that collectivity of the people. And that's a really important insight. And unfortunately, what happens shortly after that is the Cold War. And that's one reason why American politicians and lawyers and judges retrench suddenly into this more simple idea that it's all just about individuals on the one hand and the state on the other hand, because they don't want to be thinking about anything that smacks of collective rights. That sounds communist. And so that moment is lost, really, in the United States. But that really is the most serious problem of our own age as well. It's the question of mass media power and the power of now online media to shape public discourse and to do so without any kind of responsibility, legal or otherwise, to the public and to truth and to the public good. And so Europeans, Brazilians, people around the world are trying to grapple with this and hold American social media companies to account in very basic ways. And that's been read by cries of censorship and the rest of it, as I said at the outset.
So I think in a few minutes, we're going to open it up to audience questions. But before we do, I wanted to ask one final question, which is kind of, you have already alluded to each model has its problems.
Yeah.
But I think, the First Amendment scholars in this country that I know are always alert to the terrible things that would ensue if you did not have the First Amendment as an absolute right. So in some ways, when you say...
Terrible things are happening anyway.
Well, exactly, right? You say you started this book in 2015 because
Yeah.
you're like, oh gosh, everyone is aware of all of the problems of unfettered speech. Look at the social media platforms, the online bullying, the misinformation about elections, misinformation about COVID, which happened while you were writing the book. I mean, there are manifold examples of the problems of unregulated speech. At the same time, we are now witnessing a presidential administration where the president is eager to force his views on others, to force the Associated Press to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. We are in a situation, in other words, where in some ways the absolutist approach to the First Amendment has never been more important, because otherwise we're going to see the government running roughshod over individual rights. So, that's a heady question, but how do you grapple with those, in some way, incommensurable concerns?
Yeah. Well, of course, the First Amendment's current model comes out of precisely a series of reactions throughout the 20th century against government censorship and illegitimate restrictions on political speech, especially in the 19-teens and 20s against socialists and communists, in the 1950s again in the Red Scare, the Second Red Scare, in the 1960s in the Civil Rights Movement. So, and the First Amendment has a noble and proud tradition of protecting political speech. And indeed, another thing that people don't really realize is that it goes way back before 1919 and the Supreme Court wakes up. The Supreme Court only starts taking those views of the First Amendment as a citizen's right because of decades of pressure by left-wing progressive socialists, American socialists and others who have been campaigning for them to treat it as such. And so what happens in 1919, from 1919 onwards, is the Supreme Court starts to take on those progressive left-wing views. And there's a whole hidden history, which I go into, about Frederick Douglass appealing to the First Amendment and abolitionists appealing to the First Amendment, et cetera. Anyway, but your basic point is absolutely true, that it's a proud history, and it's one that we need to appeal to now. But what I'm trying to do in the book is two things: to show that the way in which that has been achieved is to try and make the rules more simple. For example, one of the ways in which American jurisprudence has done that in recent decades is to make the First Amendment content neutral. And I'm just trying to point out the first thing I'm trying to point out is the cost of this simplicity. The cost is, one thing, you cannot anymore attend to truth. Truth is irrelevant. The Supreme Court has often said the content of speech is irrelevant. That is a problematic thing to do, for example, if you're talking about political discourse, where truth is actually important. If you let people spread lies and treat them the same as truth, as social media companies love to do, you're not going to end up with a healthy political discourse. Truth, as I illustrated earlier, with a quote from Swift, I think. Did I quote Swift? No. Truth is slower than lies.
Oh, yeah.
Falsehood flies, and truth comes limping after, like a man who's thought of a clever repartee after the party is over, long after the party is over. That's a quote by Jonathan Swift in the early 18th century. It's about a basic truth. that untruth is faster and it will perpetrate more quickly. So that's one problem. The second problem is you have to pretend that speech never causes harm. Or you can only focus on immediately inciting someone to violence. That is a ridiculous standard of harm, if you will allow me to express my opinion, because so many other harms are no longer part of our jurisprudence or our thinking then. That's problematic. So those are some of the difficulties with a very simple model. And the other difficulty, the second real problem, is you stop thinking about the responsibilities of the media and how you might grapple with this. And throughout American history, as in the history of other countries, this has always been something that has been front and center. The FCC was set up in the 1930s, and it's only the latest of those types of things to regulate new forms of communication for the public good, in the public interest. Before that, films, radio, they're all treated rightly as commercial money-making operations that need to be regulated because they also have important effects on public opinion. So Americans have long done this. It's only since the 1960s they've started to back away and think the free market will take care of everything. Sadly, that's not true. And that mindset of deregulation and the government should just get out of the way and the marketplace will solve everything is the mindset that exists in the 1990s when the laws about the internet are put into place. And that's why we have now, in our current communications revolution, such completely irresponsible platforms of mass communication that now dominate political discourse. And they don't care about truth. That's the sad truth. So the answer to your question is, you need to set up regulation that is not government regulation, that is immune or able to withstand capture by the government. So you should not have an FCC that the president can sack the head of and get rid of. That's not really arm's length regulation. What you need is independent regulation that is immune to partisanship, or at least bipartisan, in the public interest. That's not a crazily difficult thing to do. We do it in all sorts of other spheres of our life. Other countries do it as well. It has its own problems, of course. But the question of whether that works or not is not ultimately a question about free speech and theories of free speech. It's ultimately a question about how strong is your democracy. And right now in this country, our democracy is not very strong. And there are all sorts of reasons for that I won't get into. But I think it can be done. Other countries are trying to do it, and we should do it.
Hear, hear. I think, yeah, we're ready to take audience questions. Cliff has a microphone. How do you want to do it?
So yeah, people can just raise their hands, and if you want to indicate who should go, I can follow your lead if that's okay.
Sure, or you can. I'm happy to delegate that.
I can also do that. That works for me. A hand rises. Here we are.
Have a hand.
All right, and a mic is coming.
The Supreme Court is regulated, if you will, by the Constitution as to what it can and cannot hear and do. However, we have something now which is not in the Constitution called the shadow doctrine or the shadow docket. Where do we go with that?
That is a deep question. I think the justices themselves are grappling with that question. As I understand it, the shadow docket is always just meant to be temporary injunctions. I understand that all the problems with it that you're implying about. I don't have an answer to that, sir. I have my hands full thinking about free speech, but that's another very big question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So just educate all of us, or educate me here. The FCC in the U.S., I understand how it's regulated and who oversees it. Can you just give us a brief walkthrough of that equivalent in, say, Europe or just a handful of other countries? This is a very practical question. How is it regulated compared to the U.S.? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, nowhere does this perfectly, as far as I know. And in some places, when you get an autocratic government, They are able to take over public broadcasting. They're able to take over the regulators of public broadcasting, and then you're in the same mess that you would be even if you didn't have those things. That's happened in Poland in the past, for example. It's happened in Hungary. It's happened in India. But I think, and I don't want to hold up the United Kingdom as some kind of beacon for how things should be done, but it happens to be a place that I know a little bit about. There is an Ofcom, an Office of Communications Regulation, that is meant to be non-partisan. It's not, as far as I know, directly in the power of the government of the day to pick and choose who sits on that board. The simple principle is that these institutions should be independent. And then it licenses broadcasters. So this has all been done for television and radio in the past. The problem is no one has figured out how to do it for the internet. Or I can talk about how the Europeans are trying to do that in a minute. But let me start with the older forms of mass communication. And so you need a license. And then if and the license requires you your broadcast to do a number of things. They should be in the public interest. They should not spread lies. You may not have politicians presenting programs in a way that, advances their political cause while making them seem like, neutral journalists, all sorts of things to make sure that the public good is safeguarded. And then if the regulator believes that you have contravened those rules, they can sanction you. They can ultimately pull you off air. That's what the FCC also theoretically has the power to do and used to do. There's a famous case where they pulled off a racist southern radio station because they refused to comply with the FCC's. Anyway, so the idea is that they have this power, and then individuals can also write to the regulator and complain about particular programs or particular instances. And all these things are public, and it's not a good idea to be constantly hauled up by the regulator, because ultimately that loses your public trust. It loses potentially your ability to continue. That's the basic model. What Europeans and Brazilians and others are trying to do with the internet now is something much less intrusive. It's simply, as I understand it, saying to Google and Facebook and any other mass communications medium, you are censoring all the time. Your algorithms amplify certain things, suppress other things. And you say you have clear-cut standards that you're following when you're doing this. So just tell us, A, what are your rules of moderation? What is allowed, what is not allowed? Why do you amplify certain things? Why do you suppress other things? Tell us. Secondly, show us that you're following those rules consistently and fairly, that you're not suppressing certain types of people or certain types of message because of the politics or the kind of person that it is. And then thirdly, report to us the society in which you're operating to show that you are doing this consistently and fairly all the time. And the larger the platform, the more onerous the obligations are to do this. And if not, we will fine you and we will take other actions against you. Well, giant screaming and squealing by Mr. Zuckerberg and Mr. Musk and the rest. But yes, in Brazil, the Supreme Court faced down Twitter, X, and managed to get them to comply.
We have a number of independent agencies that our Congress set up, various kinds, and as you know, that didn't seem to make any difference. And you pointed out the problems with this way of thinking about free speech, the problems with that way. Doesn't it come down to, if you're looking for a structure that's going to be impermeable to being abused and corrupted, that there really isn't such a thing? I mean, isn't it? There's even the one you just described, I could see that being used by certain interest or corrupt politicians or whatever. It doesn't seem to me there's going to be a mechanism whether you adopt this model or that model for free speech that can't be turned into its opposite, really.
Yes, as I said at the outset, it's always been a weaponized slogan. I mean, we can't get away from that. But if you forgive me, what you're saying is, and it's a very common American refrain, is basically saying laws can be abused and then concluding that we should have no laws. And I don't think that's a good model, intellectually or otherwise, for dealing with this problem or any other problem. So I would say, even though they can be abused, and like I said, the balancing model leads to serious problems, at the very least, we should be thinking about the harms that communication can cause and does cause, and thinking about how we can mitigate that as a society. And who's responsible for that? It's not, I mean, people are going to say crazy, racist, slanderous things all the time. That's not the real free speech problem. The real free speech problem is amplification on a massive scale, monetizing this kind of thing, and thereby distorting public discourse, as is now happening.
Okay,
Sorry.
thank you for coming out and talking to us. So who was behind the absolutist free speech movement in the 60s? Was it Barry Goldwater, these kind of people, these libertarians?
It's really interesting. I mean, there's a longer history of once the First Amendment becomes identified by the Supreme Court as basically a get out of jail, trump everything card, very quickly corporations and corporate lawyers start to pick up on this as a really great legal strategy for pushing back against any kind of regulation. If you can describe what you're doing as expressive in some way in an American court, you're very much more likely to win. And so that goes right back to the 1930s, the idea that regulation and the First Amendment are incompatible. Doesn't matter if it's just about the press or anything else that we would think of as speech. So the weaponizing of the First Amendment goes way back. Then in the 60s, it's really part of, I think there's a justice on the Supreme Court who's the vanguard of this movement called Hugo Black, who has been pushing back and pushing back and pushing back since the 50s against his colleagues who are taking an explicitly balancing approach. And by the way, Holmes and Brandeis, they are also balancing, everyone is balancing. The way that they think about harm against rights changes over time, but it's basically that. So Black is the first person really with a strongly powerful position on the court who says, look, this is what it says in the text. Congress shall make no law. Full stop, the end. So he's the first person who really starts to articulate an absolutist position. Like all absolutists, he's not an absolutist, really. He doesn't believe that you should be allowed to wear a T-shirt that says "fuck the draft" in a court of law, that you should be able to march freely to demonstrate against the Vietnam War. These are all things that he thinks would be all burn flags. This is not, for him, freedom of expression. So he's not really an absolutist, but no absolutist really is. You can't be. So that's it. And then, the really interesting thing is how to trace, as I do in the book, how this works out in the world of the media, because the moral majority, which some of you may remember, this right-wing evangelical Christian movement that starts in 1970, it starts with a rally against the FCC. It starts as a pushback against government censorship. And the FCC, until the Reagan years, had this doctrine in the public interest called the Fairness Doctrine, whereby broadcasters have to show both sides. They have to educate the public on important matters. It's not just both sides. It's telling the public what's important in the world, and these are important political issues, and then explaining that there are different sides to it. And this is attacked viciously by, especially by right-wing politicians, as a form of concealed censorship. And then money comes into it too. This kind of regulation is unwelcome to broadcasting companies. And when the cable networks become a thing, they push back very heavily against the FCC. I mean, as late as 1969, the Supreme Court issues a judgment unanimously upholding the FCC's rights and saying something like, the First Amendment is very important in public broadcasting, but it is the rights of the public that are at play, not the rights of broadcasters. So it's this idea of the collective, of the public good, of the First Amendment having a meaning that is not just about individuals and not just about corporations, but about the public. A social value, exactly. But then in the Reagan years, this combination of deregulatory push by corporations themselves and right-wing politics really chips away at that until the FCC itself reverses course, does away with the fairness doctrine, says the First Amendment's just about the rights of individuals, government should get out of the way. Yeah, absolutely. That talk radio absolutely comes out of that moment. Yeah.
All right. Well, on that note, unfortunately, we are done with Q&A. I want to thank both of our guests for being here again.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.